When native speakers of English think of the inventory of sounds in the Spanish language, the one that probably comes to mind first is trilled R. It's the most different from any sound in our language, and usually the most difficult for us to learn to pronounce correctly. Interestingly, there are native dialects of Spanish that don't trill R in all phonetic contexts, and others that don't trill it at all, pronouncing some other sound in its place. In today's video, we'll talk about the most common dialectal variant of trilled R, what I refer to as sibilant R, or R assimilation, and native Spanish speakers sometimes refer to as R arrastrada. We'll discuss how it's pronounced, which dialects in the Spanish-speaking world use it, in what phonetic contexts it appears, and whether you as a student of Spanish should use it instead of standard trilled R. Sibilant R is a dialectal variation of trilled R. In other words, it's a sound that's used instead of trilled R in some dialects. Before we get into the dialectology and sociolinguistics of this sound, I'd like to just give you an idea of how it's pronounced. Sibilant R is a voiced, retroflex, dentoalveolar sibilant. It's pronounced something like a combination of English retroflex R, like in the word robot, and the zh sound of English words like garage. So something like plus zh at the same time. Zh, zh, zh. In phonetic transcription, I'll represent this sound as an R with an inverted circumflex, like this. Here are some example words pronounced first with standard trilled R and then with sibilant R. Rápido, rápido. Carro, carro. Arroz, arroz. Reto, reto. Rosa, rosa. Reina, reina. Restaurante, restaurante. Burro, burro. Tierra, tierra. Gorra, gorra. The literature on this subject suggests that sibilant R, or close variations of it, can be heard in dialects in northern Spain, Guatemala, Costa Rica, the mountainous regions of the Andean nations, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Chile, as well as Paraguay and northwestern Argentina. While the consensus among linguists is that sibilant R originated in northern Spain, in the Americas there seems to be a strong correlation between sibilant R and the historical influence of indigenous languages. The different dialects that employ sibilant R don't all use it in the same range of phonetic contexts. Some employ it relatively infrequently, while others use it all over the place. The discussion that follows is derived from observations I made when I was living in the Ecuadorian highlands and may not apply perfectly to all R assimilating dialects. Still, it's a great starting place and should give you the tools you need to analyze any R assimilating dialect. On the far end of the spectrum, there are dialects that never assimilate any R's, pretty much ever. These include the S-aspirating dialects we discussed in our video on S-aspiration. I think it's an interesting observation that S-aspirating dialects are not R-assimilating. One small step along the spectrum, there are dialects that only assimilate R in one phonetic context, that is, words that start with R when the preceding word ends with S. In all other contexts, they trill R in the standard fashion. Here are some example phrases with sibilant R at the beginning of a word when the previous word ends in S. First, I'll pronounce the R word by itself with standard trilled R, then as part of a word pair with sibilant R. Rosas, las rosas. Rodillas, las rodillas. Rápido, más rápido. Ratones, los ratones. Reciente, más reciente. Reglas, las reglas. Razones, las razones. Raro, más raro. Now I know that sibilant R in these examples doesn't sound like standard neutral pronunciation to a lot of students, But I think that's because these are isolated word pairs. In complete sentences with other flapped and trilled R's pronounced normally, you really don't notice that these R's are assimilated, and they sound perfectly normal. Don't worry, I'll give examples of whole sentences later on, and you'll see what I mean. One more step along the spectrum, there are dialects that in addition to the case we just described, also assimilate all R's at the beginning of words, double R's in the middle of words, and R's after L, N, and S. In other words, all R's that are normally trilled. Here are some examples pronounced first with standard pronunciation and then with sibilant R. Regular, regular. Religioso, religioso. Remoto, remoto. Zorro, zorro. Aburrido, aburrido. Alrededor, alrededor. Sonrisa, sonrisa. Additionally, dialects that assimilate all trilled R's generally also assimilate the consonant clusters DR and TR. This pattern is different from standard pronunciation, because in standard pronunciation, the R in DR and TR consonant clusters is never trilled. It's just a simple flap. And since assimilation is an alternative to trilling, you think this R wouldn't be assimilated. But for whatever reason, in dialects that assimilate all trilled R's, the R in DR and TR clusters is also usually assimilated. Here are examples of words with DR and TR pronounced first with standard pronunciation and then assimilated. Tres, tres. Alejandro, Alejandro. Trago, trago. Saldrá, saldrá. Contra, contra. Dramático, dramático. Dentro, dentro. Now, certain sources I've consulted suggest that in Ecuadorian dialects, DR and TR aren't assimilated when they appear in the middle of a word after a vowel. But as I say these words out loud to myself, I feel that our assimilating native speakers would assimilate all of these TRs. When I lived in Ecuador, I know I heard atrás pronounced as atrás a million times. And I think they'd assimilate at least some of these DRs, so I'm sure that the sources I consulted aren't 100% accurate. But I don't know if there are any genuine limits on DR and TR assimilation or what rule might describe them. Any native speakers who are familiar with our assimilating dialects who would like to comment on this, I welcome your input. Because I'm not sure about DR and TR following a vowel, I will forego pronouncing these examples out loud. And on the far end of the spectrum, we have dialects that also consistently assimilate R's that in standard Spanish would only be trilled in emphatic speech, in syllable final position within a word, and at the end of a word. Once again, this pattern differs from standard pronunciation, because these R's are normally only trilled in emphatic speech. But in far end of the spectrum are assimilating dialects. They're assimilated pretty much all the time. Here are some examples pronounced first with standard pronunciation and then with assimilated pronunciation. Carta, carta. Garganta, garganta. Perdón, perdón. Terminar, terminar. Hablar, hablar. Comer, comer. Decir, decir. Assimilating R at the beginning of a word, when the preceding word ends in S, is perfectly standard. There's nothing unusual about this at all. This is a very common way to pronounce trilled R following S in dialects that don't aspirate S. One step over along the spectrum, assimilating all trilled R's is not standard pronunciation. What I mean by that is that it's associated with identifiable regional dialects. But I don't believe it carries any educational, socioeconomic, or ethnic implications. In other words, there are well-educated and upper-class people of all ethnicities who do this. So, for example, a young woman from Cuenca, Ecuador, who speaks this way, would immediately be identified by her accent as being from Cuenca, instead of, say, Guayaquil or Esmeraldas. But she wouldn't necessarily be judged as being uneducated or working class, and there would be no way of guessing her ethnic background simply because of this one feature of her pronunciation. But as we move one more step along the spectrum, the same cannot be said for assimilating all or most R's at the end of syllables and the end of words. Research has been done on sociolinguistic attitudes and perceptions in Ecuador, and Ecuadorian people report that they associate this more extreme R assimilation with lower socioeconomic status and education, smaller or more rural communities, and the influence of indigenous languages. Please understand that I do not offer this description as a criticism of anyone. I've lived in several rural communities in Ecuador, and I love Ecuador's indigenous people. And when I hear people speaking with dialects that are characteristic of the Andean highlands, my heart aches with nostalgia. I share this information with you only so you can understand that this particular pronunciation is not standard, even in Ecuador. It's associated with particular socioeconomic and cultural groups. Now, all these factors are very difficult to quantify, and any discussion is necessarily a simplification. There certainly are people of higher socioeconomic classes who exhibit this pronunciation. There are also people who are not indigenous or particularly influenced by indigenous language or culture who talk this way. Back when I lived in Ecuador, I had a close acquaintance who was a colonel in the Ecuadorian military who exhibited some of the most extreme R assimilation I have to this day ever heard. He was well above average in education and wealth, and he was of Spanish and other European ancestry, so he seemed to break all the stereotypes. But still, when listening to him speak, an Ecuadorian listener would undoubtedly make assumptions about his origins and upbringing because of this feature. Again, this entire discussion is a simplification, but it'll have to do for now. Alright, with the foundation we've established of phonetics and sociolinguistics, let's listen to some sample sentences. Some of these I'll pronounce with limited R assimilation, others with moderate R assimilation, and some with extreme R assimilation, so you can compare them side by side. A Dios rogando y con el mazo dando. A grandes males, grandes remedios. Cuando el gato no está, los ratones bailan. Lo que no se llevan los ladrones, aparece por los rincones. No es más rico quien más tiene, sino el que menos necesita. Quien siembra vientos recoge tempestades. Corazón codicioso no tiene reposo. De una cebolla no nace una rosa. Dos no riñen si uno no quiere. El que rompe, paga. En boca cerrada no entran moscas. El que mucho corre, pronto para. Nadie es profeta en su tierra. Algo tendrá el agua cuando la bendicen. Otro vendrá que bueno me hará. En el país de los ciegos, el tuerto es rey. A burro muerto, la cebada al rabo. A rey muerto, rey puesto. Muerto el perro, se acabó la rabia. No te cierres una puerta si no has abierto otra. Quien da pan a perro ajeno, pierde pan y pierde perro. Si hay trato, pueden ser amigos perro y gato. Alright, so I think that's a pretty solid introduction to sibilant R in Ecuador. Naturally, this discussion couldn't possibly cover all the complexities of this topic, and so my breakdown of it must necessarily be a simplification. Any native speakers who'd like to contribute to the discussion, I'd love to read your comments. While I don't know for certain, I suspect that the situation with sibilant R is pretty similar in the other Andean nations. I have no experience with sibilant R in any of the other dialects where it's purported to exist, so I can't get into their specifics, but I hope that the introduction we've given here will give you the tools to analyze any dialect you encounter in your travels. One final question is this. Should you, as a student of Spanish, pronounce sibilant R instead of standard trilled R? Here are my recommendations. Assimilating R only after S is perfectly normal and doesn't sound unusual at all. It's a very common way for native speakers to resolve the tricky phonetic problem of trilled R after S, although it's not the only way, as we discussed in the video on aspirated S. So sibilant R in this context is something any student of Spanish could do and sound perfectly normal. For students who absolutely can't trill R in any context, moderate R assimilation might be an alternative. Of course, I recommend that you work hard at learning standard trilled R first. And when I say work hard, I mean give it a couple of years of solid effort. But if in the end you're truly incapable of trilling R, this is definitely better than an English-style R, or some of the tortured, forced alternatives students sometimes invent. At least it's a dialectal variation that actually exists in the Spanish-speaking world. So I guess if you absolutely can't trill R, this is something you could do instead. What if you can trill the R, but you live in a place where people assimilate the R? I recommend that you continue to trill the R in the standard fashion. Natives who assimilate R recognize that their pronunciation is non-standard, and I don't think they'll appreciate your pronunciation more if you also assimilate. And while when I lived in Ecuador I knew English-speaking students who went all the way with R assimilation, I don't recommend it. Extreme R assimilation is much less common throughout the Spanish-speaking world, and it's associated with specific socioeconomic, cultural, and ethnic groups. Nobody is going to think that your Spanish sounds better or more authentic if you do this, because you are not a member of any of the groups that do it. Even native Spanish speakers who speak with extreme R assimilation will expect you to speak with more standard pronunciation. Alright, this has been our discussion of Spanish sibilant R. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and if you have any questions about the Spanish language, please ask in the comments. I'd be happy to consider making a video to answer your question.